Hi everyone, so happy to be here. My name is Bridget and I'm your host for this evening's In Conversation with Elif Shafak to discuss her latest book, How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division. Right now, before we begin, please allow me to give a very short introduction first of Elif. Elif is an award-winning author who writes both in Turkish and English. She's published 18 books, of which 11 are novels, including her 2019 book, 10 minutes, 38 seconds in this strange world, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Her previous book, The 40 Rules of Love, was chosen by the BBC as one of the 100 novels that shaped our world. If you've read Elif's book, you would know that she's someone who doesn't shy away from writing about taboo, complex and unspoken issues. Through her story, she advocates for free speech as well as the rights of women, the LGBT community and minorities, for being very vocal about the violence against women, for discussing traditions like honor killing, and for raking up a past that others prefer to be forgotten. She has been criticized, sued, and investigated. But all these have not stopped Elif from using the power of words to continue bearing witness to this world we're in. It is no surprise then to know that her books have been translated in 55 languages across the world. Her stories have enthralled audiences spanning cultures, ethnicity, and ideologies. Now, this power of stories to connect people will therefore be a key theme that we'll discuss tonight. So for all the audience joining us tonight from Malaysia, Jakarta, from Amsterdam, Hong Kong, all these many cities across the world, please stay with us. We've got an exciting hour ahead as we attempt to unpack all these weighty issues that Elif has managed to just compress in 90 pages, from tribalism to the fragility of democracy, to the power and paralysis that anger can evoke, to the dangers of apathy. And of course, what is it that we need to deal with this confusing age we're in? So before we begin this, we thought we would run a poll first to understand our very diverse audience. I think we've got, wow, 137 of you. KB, do you mind if we could bring up the poll? Right, so if you could let us know which of the topics below interests you most. We really want to know, yeah? Which one of this? Is it the identity, polarization, tribalism in societies? Is it the rise of anxiety due to politics, strife, and the pandemic? Or is it this idea of empathy and the power of storytelling? So click on the poll, let us know more about you. Wow, we've got people from Canada, USA, wow, Malaysia, great, Australia as well. So Elif, as I was telling you before this event, I had shared about tonight's event on my social media networks, and I received so many enthusiastic responses. People were really looking forward to engaging with you. I was very touched by a young man who told me that he's read almost all of your books. He said, in his words, verbatim, that you've changed his life, you transformed his life, yeah? So I'm really, really touched, and I know that we've got a lot of diehard fans with us, as we can see from the chat. So many people from across the world to be with us tonight. So I think this will be an exciting chat. Okay, the results are out, huh? We've got 23% wanting to talk about identity, 24% on anxiety, and of course, more than half of you on empathy and the power of storytelling. Thank you, everyone. And of course, so then it shall be. Shall we now just kick off straight with this whole idea of Storyland, right? Elif's most favorite land to be in, I think. Tell us, Elif, about your love for stories. How did you become so attracted and in love with stories?
Well, thank you so much, Bridget. You know, this is such a generous introduction. I'm very pleased that we're having this conversation together, and I'm very moved that we have such a diverse audience. It really matters a lot to me that we can connect with people from completely different backgrounds at first glance. I think I started writing fiction at an early age, actually, in my childhood. But that's not because I was planning to become a writer. I didn't know such a thing was possible, to be honest. There were no writers around me, no such role models. But I was a very lonely child. I was raised by a single working mother, and I was an only child. I grew up without seeing my half brothers for a long time. So I thought life was quite boring. And I think Storyland gave me a much more interesting, much more colorful world to be in. The desire to become an established author came to me in my early 20s. And that's when I knew that I was going to dedicate my life to books and to writing.
Hmm. Now, what is it about stories, though? I mean, you've spoken and shared about some of the power of stories. I was very moved by the story of your grandmother, how she cured people who came to see her. And tell us, how did growing up in that childhood, foster this love for stories?
I think one of the things that characterized my childhood was the sense of displacement, maybe ruptures, rather than a sense of continuity. I did not grow up in a typical patriarchal Turkish family. Some might call it in a dysfunctional way. I maybe grew up in the sense that I was born actually in France, in Strasbourg, to Turkish parents. And the first house that I remember was full of immigrants, students, idealists, people dreaming of revolution, talking about the revolution, smoking a lot of cigarettes and this tobacco, layers of tobacco smoke in the air, and reading Jean-Paul Sartre, but not so much Simone de Beauvoir, And from that environment, when my parents got separated, my father stayed in France and my mother brought me to Turkey, to Ankara, which for her was, of course, motherland. But for me, Turkey was a completely new country to discover. And we ended up in my grandmother's environments, which was very, very conservative, very patriarchal, very inward looking. And I think I felt a bit like both insider and outsider, like on the edge of that society. Now, fast forward, I think one of the reasons why I pay so much attention to the periphery of the society is because naturally, it feels natural to me to empathize with anyone who is made to feel as the other. For whatever reason, the color of your skin, how you look, your sexual identity, for whatever reason, if you are labeled as the other and pushed to the margins, there's a part of me that immediately, pays attention to that person's story, because I think there are lots of stories along the periphery that have been silenced and forgotten and erased. And I am no stranger to that feeling.
Right. So that childhood of displacement, of not being hyphenated in identity and culture in that way, helped you to foment that sense of empathy. I suppose that's so important for any writer. Yeah. I love this quote that you've got in your book. It says, "To be an emigre, therefore, means to forever bear shards of glass in your pockets." That kind of really, really touched me when I read that, because it's so real, yeah, when we reach into our pocket and to be reminded the whole time.
Absolutely, because we can't forget, we can feel like, okay, this is where I am, this is where I belong. But then distractedly, you put your hands in your pockets and something cuts deep. You had forgotten, but it doesn't let you forget that you have these fractures, layers of identity. It is not always a bad thing, though. There's a melancholy to it, there's a sorrow to it, or there's a sense of loss to it that I think we need to be honest about and we can talk about. But at the same time, to have multiple belongings can be a source of strength and hopefully wisdom. It can give us so many things. There's the good and the bad. So I want to talk about that in a more nuanced way. But if I may quickly add this, I think as human beings, we all have multitudes. It doesn't matter whether you grew up in multiple cultures, whether you dream in more than one language when you go, to bed at night, or whether you were born and raised in the same town. Doesn't matter. I think we all have multiple belongings. But the problem is the age we're living in never ever encourages multiplicity. Just the opposite. We are expected to belong to one box. and stay in that box. And I think multiplicity is something worth fighting for. It's closer to our nature, you know, as human beings. We're more fluid than we are allowed to think.
Yeah, you use this idea of inner gardens and cultural ghettos, right? Of how we draw up all this protection and to be safe, to feel safe almost because of the age that we're in. So what is it? What can we do to help people accept and to see this multiplicity in others?
Yes, you kindly earlier asked me about my grandmother, and one of the things that I learned from her was that you need to pay attention to circles. So she was a very, you know, she wasn't a well-educated woman, and yet she was someone who wholeheartedly supported women's education. And she was a very wise person. Now, I love books, I love knowledge, but I also know that there are many people out there who don't have a diploma and yet they're so wise. Just like that, there are many people out there who have a diploma and yet they're so ignorant. So knowledge is not dependent on a diploma or a degree. But the reason why I'm mentioning my grandmother here is because in her world of superstitions and magic, you know, one of the things she did was, you know, many Turkish women do this in Anatolia or across the Middle East. Like if you have skin diseases, they heal it with by drawing circles around it. I mentioned this in my first TED talk. That also taught me that if you want to dry something up, you know, you surround it, you enclose it. Now imagine, take it as a metaphor, but imagine our lives being surrounded by walls. Imagine this world in which we're made to believe that sameness is safety, that we will be safer if we're surrounded by sameness. Imagine this world in which we are constantly asked to forget that as human beings, we're interconnected. So much so that a virus that originates in one part of China, in one part of the world, sorry, can affect the lives of people in another part of the world. We have massive global challenges ahead of us, whether it's our climate, another financial crisis, another pandemic, cyber terrorism. Everything shows that humanity has problems in common, you know, and it makes much more sense to understand that we're interconnected. So coming back to this idea of being circled by walls, I think there's something very dangerous in that kind of tribalism. It makes us, you know, live in an environment in which we're surrounded by the echoes of our own voice. If all my friends think like me, speak like me, vote like me, talk like me, it means I am surrounded by echoes and we don't learn from echoes. It's also a very narcissistic existence. So all I'm trying to say is there's something valuable, precious in diversity. I know it's not a favorable word anymore, but I come from a country that has never, ever appreciated diversity. And I think by losing that cosmopolitan heritage, we have lost a lot.
Right. And you do mention in the book about the use of language, which can be very powerful for good and also for bad. Language can also be used to polarize groups of people. With the way we use it can be used to create apathy, to create stereotypes, yeah? And language can be used to create fear, which is at the root of polarization, politics right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think words can hurt, words can heal, and we should never lose sight of that. So lots of the darkest chapters in human history, including the Holocaust, genocide, civil wars, they didn't start right away with, you know, mass murders. They didn't start with mass violence and atrocities. Actually, they all started with words. So how we talk about the other, how we refer to people who seem to be different to us is incredibly important. So for instance, in Europe, I hear this language, this rhetoric, when sometimes people talk about immigrants or refugees, these words such as, you know, infesting. What does that mean? As if you're vermin, as if you're insects infesting. You know, what kind of choice is that? Or maybe I should give you another example. I think our political language of politics became more and more replete with martial metaphors. Suddenly, politics became like a war. So, which means opponents are not opponents anymore, but they're enemies,
Mm.
which means anyone who disagrees with me is an enemy of the nation or enemy of the people. So we jump from one dangerous metaphor to another dangerous metaphor. And I think this is how we lose democracy. It all happens through words.
Right. And of course, you talk a lot about this, the fragility of democracy, how many of us might have taken it for granted. Yeah, we think we've been in democracy, some, especially those in long established democracies, and they think we're good. There's nothing to worry about, but you say otherwise.
Indeed, I do. I mean, and if I may share this, I remember years ago when I used to live in Istanbul, I remember an American scholar telling me that it was very understandable for me to be a feminist because, after all, I lived in Turkey and I came from a Turkish background. And the way she said it, with all the good intentions, no doubt, but the way she said it made me realize there's this duality, geographical duality in the minds of many Westerners. They tend to think, and they did this for a long time, as if, you know, women's rights, human rights, rule of law, freedom of speech, these are issues that people in the East should worry about, but not so much people in the West, because they're already beyond that threshold. They've already achieved these rights. So why worry about them? And I think what happened after 2016, because Brexit happened, Trump happened in 2016 onwards, we have seen rise of populist nationalist movements. I think more and more people realize that, after all, there's no such thing as solid lands versus liquid lands. And in fact, East and West, we're all living through liquid times, which means you can't take his time for granted. We can't assume that tomorrow is always going to be more progressive than yesterday. And sometimes countries can go backwards. And if I may add this quickly, I think if it is true that countries can go backwards, as it happened in Turkey, I think we women need to be more alert and more aware, because when societies tumble into ultranationalism, religious fundamentalism, or populist authoritarianism, the first rights that will be taken away will be women's rights and minority rights. So as women, as minorities, we have to become bigger defenders of democracy.
Right. And so I wanted to come back to, again, this use of stories then to unpack these very difficult topics and themes in your books. How have you attempted to do that, you know, by talking about, I mean, your latest book was about the death of a prostitute, for instance. What triggered you to say, I want to talk about this, I want to use this method to discuss an issue of a marginalized person?
Yes, I am a fiction writer. I'm a storyteller, and I think I love stories. I dedicate my life to words and letters, language. But that doesn't mean that I am not interested in silences. So just as I chase stories, I also chase silences. And by that, I mean, what are the untold stories? What are the issues we cannot talk about? Who are the people who have been silenced? It matters to me. So in many of my books, I think minorities play an important role. There's a desire to bring the periphery to the center, to make the invisible a little bit more visible, to make the unheard a bit more heard. I find it important. I also believe that literature can rehumanize people who have been dehumanized. Because when I know someone else's story, suddenly that person is not the other for me. I realize actually the other is my brother, is my sister. I am the other. We're not that different in our sorrows, joys, frustrations. There's something very essential about humankind that politics makes us forget, but art and literature helps us to remember again and again.
Yeah, you talk about this need to be an intellectual nomad as well, this ability to listen widely, to let your mind travel actually in different ways. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, let us not have a permanent address. Let us never say, this is my tribe, this is my permanent address. Let us be a bit more like migratory birds, at least. Let us migrate from one place to another, because we do learn from differences. I think as a writer, I don't like it when writers try to preach or teach something or give the answers. I don't know the answers myself. How can I give the answers? I am also learning. And that to me is very important. We are learners in this life, and learning is endless. The problem is we have forgotten to say, I don't know. When was the last time we ever said, I don't know? The only time we say, I don't know, is when we're speaking to children. If children ask us really complicated questions, we say, oh, I don't know. But between adults, do we ever say, I don't know? You can ask me anything. If I don't know the answer, I'll just Google it. And in the next 5 minutes,
Exactly.
I will be able to say a few words, giving the impression that I have an idea, an opinion. But in fact, I know nothing about that subject. So I think too much information is an obstacle in front of true knowledge. And it makes us maybe arrogant. We forgot the humility of being able to say, I really don't know, I need to learn about this. And being an intellectual nomad makes us realize that actually questions are more important than answers sometimes. To be able to question, doubt, ask, never be 100% sure of your certainties. Just leave the door a little bit open to enter into proper intellectual exchange. And if what you say makes sense to me, to be ready to revise my opinions. That kind of fluid approach, that kind of humility is something that we are losing to a large extent in the age of digital technologies.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you spoke right at the start of the book. I mean, you talked about needing to listen first in order to be heard.
Yeah, it's the same. I mean, I think two sides of the coin. I also respect people's demand to be heard, because it's something very existential. It's also quite ironic, because if you remember early 2000s, there was so much optimism back then. The biggest optimists were tech optimists, actually, and they assumed that by spreading information, by spreading digital technologies, you could democratize the world automatically. That was the expectation. But it didn't work out like that. And fast forward, I think we have entered the age of anxiety. We carry an existential angst. Some of us, we hide it better than others, but we, almost all of us, have an existential angst that is triggered by uncertainty, frustration, the times we're living in, and it's very understandable. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's healthier for me, the way I see it, to be able to talk about these issues rather than suppress them. And coming back to your question about listening, in this age, there's a cacophony of noises, and yet we feel voiceless. That paradox is very interesting. So we have to become better listeners. If we can listen to people who have not been listened to properly, then more and more people will stop feeling voiceless in today's world.
Right. So I was wondering, so when you wrote this book itself, what compelled you? What were some of the particular world events that might have happened? Where were you? What was your state of mind when you said, okay, I'm going to put down the novel that I might be working on, and I'm going to write this thing?
Yes, indeed. And actually, at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember seeing some publishers with good intentions sharing messages on social media saying, this is going to be a huge change for many professions, but not so much for writers, especially novelists, because novelists are solitary creatures. They're used to working on their own from home, so the lockdown won't affect them as much. I disagree. I think that wasn't my experience at all. As writers, we're not disconnected from the world we're living in. So in the middle of a pandemic, when people are dying in hundreds and thousands, when there's so much inequality in the world, when so much is happening in the world, you find yourself questioning what you're doing. Does it really matter if I find the perfect synonym? Does it really matter if I move that comma to the next sentence? Is this the kind of book that I should be working on right now? So there are existential questions also for writers. And I realized that I had to put aside what I was working on, and I wanted to respond to this moment in time. Doris Lessing has this beautiful quote. She says, literature is analysis after the event. Things happen, then some time needs to pass, and writers need to digest. In that regard, all writing is in retrospect. You look back. I understand that and I agree. However, the time we're living in, I think also requires literature to turn into analysis during the event, whilst things are happening. How do I respond to this moment in time? So I wanted to write a little manifesto about anxiety, anger, frustration, all these negative emotions that we deal with, rather than pretending that they don't exist. I want to embrace them and hopefully turn them into something more positive and constructive, both for individuals, but also for our communities and societies.
So who would you say is your main target? Who did you want to write this thesis for? Did you have someone in your mind? Was it a young person, a digital native, or did you have someone in mind?
I will never generalize readers, because I do know that every reader is unique, like our fingerprints, It's just, to me, amazing to see couples who have been married for 45 years. They read the same book. One of them loves the book, the other one not so much. I have met good friends who share everything in their lives, every secret possible, and yet they read the same book. They feel connected to very different characters for different reasons. And that is why, because I think, again, a writer's job is to ask questions, to create an open, democratic space. The novel, I believe, is one of our last remaining democratic, diverse, egalitarian, inclusive spaces. The doors of a novel is open to everyone. And at the end of that journey, every reader is going to come up with their own answers, with their own interpretations, and I have to respect that diversity. So I have no generalizations depending on race or gender or ethnicity. As I said, the gates of a story should be open to everyone.
Right. So you talk a lot about also the use of social media, right? You talked about the optimism of the Arab Spring, and then follow from that the disillusionment actually of maybe tech is not really giving us what we had wanted, and then watching the recent documentaries of how tech is actually manipulating us. What are your thoughts about how our young digital natives are then the fact that they are born into this world of chaos, information overload, and plus the fact that they're the TikTok generation, they're watching short videos, short bursts. Maybe they're going to find it hard to even read a book or to listen to our stories. What are your thoughts as a writer in this defining age?
Yeah, indeed. Earlier I mentioned one of my TED Talks. I gave 2 TED Global Talks. And the reason why I want to bring it up is because the first one was many years ago. And back then, the guidelines for speakers was try to limit your talk to 19 minutes. Now, fast forward, years passed, and the second time TED was organized, or I was invited to speak, the guidelines was try to limit your talk to 11 minutes. Because the world attention span average had shrunk. Now that makes me very sad, so we can't pay attention to a talk or to anything more than 11 minutes, 12 minutes. So, something is changing very fast, right? And it says a lot about where we are right now. I make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. We live in an age in which we are bombarded by information. We have way too much information, less knowledge, even less wisdom. We need to change this ratio. So let's deal with less information, which means let's try not to get all of our information from social media, because social media is based on speed. You have to consume fast and it's endless. And after a while, it creates numbness. We don't process this information. So rather than that, let's try to increase our knowledge in life. And knowledge comes from books. It comes from investigative journalism, longer pieces, but slow journalism. For knowledge, we have to slow down, and we need to go into an inner garden. Ultimately, let's aim for wisdom. For wisdom, we need empathy. We need to bring the mind and the heart together. We need emotional intelligence. We belittle emotions, because people think if you show emotions, you're going to be weak. And this puts a lot of pressure on so many people. I don't think emotions are a source of weakness at all, Emotions have high energy. and it's very human. In my country, people think women are emotional, men are rational. That is nonsense. As human beings, we are emotional creatures. So, and there's a power to it. So for wisdom, we need to embrace not only rational mind, but also the human heart. And I think for all of that, we need a more nuanced way of thinking. We have to slow down and pay more attention and have a longer attention span.
That's going to be a real big challenge, I think, with the young generation. I mean, I have a son, a teenager, and really just convincing him to ditch a fast-paced video game to settle down for a book is now becoming more and more difficult as he ages and he grows older. Yeah.
True. And I completely relate with what you're saying as a parent myself. But if I may add this, it's very interesting that, for instance, the novel, which is a slower genre, right, a bigger canvas, was expected to disappear about 20 years ago. I remember reading article after article about the death of the novel, for instance. It didn't happen that way. The age we're living in, for sure, is based on speed, but the faster it moves, the deeper our need for something different, the deeper for our need to connect with nature, for instance, with earth. The earth under our feet is not dead, it's not inert. We just don't see it. So I think maybe the pandemic helped us to rethink our priorities, our values, and it also made us realize that actually the most precious things in life are the immaterial things, like family, like love, like sisterhood, like friendship. So this is a time of reckoning, not for children and teenagers, of course, but for our generations. I think we are thinking about this need of something other than fast-moving news cycle.
Yeah, you mentioned in your book about people saying, we'll never go back to the normal. We'll have a new normal.
Yeah.
And yet you point out that, was there really a normal before?
Yes, indeed. Because, again, in a well-meaning way, we say, let's go back to the normal. But that normal wasn't normal for so many people. We tend to forget that. And we need to understand inequality, or inequalities, plural, whether it's gender inequality, racial inequality, regional inequality, but also digital inequality. If some children in the world can easily access laptops, while millions of other children have no way of catching up on their education, what kind of digital inequality is this? And why aren't we bothered by that? So I think we have to understand that we are at a crossroads. We can't go back. We have to move forward and create a better society, which means a fairer society. And for that, we have to pay attention to equality, to diversity, to inclusion. And I believe sincerely that we need to empower the disempowered.
Right. So I'm going to ask you one last question before we go to the audience question, and that is on what you regard, you say, the most dangerous emotion, which is the...
Yes, I think it's apathy or numbness. And again, when I read the memoirs of people who have survived horrific moments in human history, the survivors of genocides, Holocaust or civil wars, they always ask this question: how is it possible that human beings can do this to each other? Is it because we're evil by nature? And the survivors are interestingly saying, yes, there are some evil people, but actually their numbers are relatively small. So that doesn't explain the fact that atrocities can happen in human history on a wider scale. How do you explain this? And the answer that they're coming up with is maybe the opposite of goodness is not necessarily evil. The opposite of kindness is not necessarily wickedness. I think the opposite of good is actually numbness, is the moment we become indifferent. If I stop caring about your story, your sorrow, if you stop caring about mine, just because somebody tells us that we belong in different tribes, if it doesn't affect us, what's happening outside the window, that kind of indifference, that kind of apathy, lack of emotions, I think is the most dangerous emotion.